Thank you so much for joining us today and welcome to the Henry Moore Studios and Gardens. And my name is Laura Barlow. I'm the Senior Curator of Collections and Research here. We really appreciate you coming out on such a wet and wild, windy day for our last talk of the public season this year. We have this year been celebrating Henry Moore's encounters with creative professionals throughout his career. And tonight we're delighted to welcome Antony Penrose, photographer, co-founder and co-director of the Lee Miller Archives, and son of Roland Penrose and Lee Miller, as he shares his personal insights into creative friendships and exchanges between his parents, Henry Moore, and the Surrealist circle. Antony's unique perspective promises a fascinating and richly illustrated exploration of these artistic encounters, offering a rare glimpse into the world of Surrealism and British modern art. Antony's photographic career began at an early age, mentored well by his mother, taking photos of artists such as Picasso during the 1960s, among other encounters with artists on camera. Antony began then working in 16mm filmmaking, producing documentaries such as The King's Horses in 1977 and Migrate to Survive 1978, which led to establishing the Penrose Film Productions Limited, which received 18 produced credits for documentaries, technical films, and drama shorts. Antony's dedicated a large part of his life to research into the lives of his parents, Lee Miller and Roland Penrose, and their circle of artistic friends. He established the Lee Miller Archives with his late wife Susanna in 1980, and today with his daughter Antony is the co-director of Farley's House and Gallery Limited, which comprises the archives, the house, museum and galleries, and the Penrose collection. Antony lectures regularly and writes on photography and fine art. He has several publications which are able to buy widely as well. Antony has also written performance pieces based on his parents' lives and works, including The Angel and The Fiend and The Life of Lee Miller, which has been staged widely in the US and the UK. His first book, The Lives of Lee Miller, has been adapted into a major motion picture, Lee, released in 2024. And Antony has recently opened the major exhibition of Lee Miller's work, currently on view at Tate in London. And with that, I would like to welcome Antony Penrose to the stage. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you all for being here. I can't describe to you how exciting it is to be back here. It is just so wonderful to revisit this place that I have known, like of old, and to come back and see what a fantastic job you've made of opening it to the public. But you know all about that. You probably know a lot about Henry Moore. And so this talk that I'm going to give you is actually about his relationship with my parents. And who were they? Well, I hope you'll understand when you see the story, because I'd like to start by introducing you to my dad, that's Roland Penrose. And the poet André Breton, the Surrealist poet, named him Surrealist dans l'amitié, Surrealist in friendship. He was a poet, a painter, a dreamer, who lived by his love and desire for art. He was born in 1900. His mother, a gentle, kindly person, had 4 children. The 4th had not been born at this point, but the eldest, Alec, he became an important Norfolk landowner. Lionel, he became a really renowned geneticist, and he engineered all the brains onto his side of the family, so my cousin is Roger Penrose, the mathematician, and there's not a lot of brains left for us. And then this is Roland, my dad. The youngest brother, Beacus, had not yet been born. I'm always really astonished that my dad did not become a transvestite, having dressed like that as a kid. My grandfather was a portrait painter of some distinction, but after he married a very wealthy lady, he stopped painting portraits and he began painting heavy-duty religious scenes like this. But he did pause long enough to paint my dad in this manner. And I was always so disappointed that I could never get my son to dress up in the same clothes. My dad, born 1900, was just old enough to serve in the First World War. As a family, they were all very devout Quakers and therefore passive resistance, or rather, conscientious objectors. But Roland joined and became an ambulance driver in the Friends ambulance unit, and he briefly saw service in northern Italy. It was a tremendously waking up moment for him, because confrontation with violence and suffering and appreciating people from outside his social class, that reinforced the foundations for his deeply held pacifist and socialist beliefs. On demob, he went straight to Queen's College, Cambridge. There were no courses in art. He had to enroll in architecture, and he nearly died of boredom. The man that saved his life was this guy, fellow Quaker Roger Fry, an exciting figure who'd known Picasso. He was the man that brought post-impressionism to England. Fry, himself a painter, introduced Roland to the Bloomsbury luminaires, Maynard Keynes, Clive and Vanessa Bell, Duncan Grant, Virginia and Leonard Woolf. And when Roland graduated in 1922, Fry's advice was, go to Paris and join an art school there. And his father gave Roland an allowance on the condition he promised to never, ever, ever go to the kind of studios where they used nude female models for life classes. Roland shot off to Paris, and his first teacher was André Lotte. Lotte was very keen on Cubism, the new fascination at that moment. But after about 18 months, the poor English boy from a sheltered background was close to burnout. So he went to live on the Mediterranean coast of France, at Cassis-sur-Mer. He bought this little house. Of course, he knew the place because it was well known to the Bloomsbury people. And in fact, Virginia Woolf had stayed close by at Fontcruz a couple of times. Roland at this point was great friends with this guy, the Greek painter Janko Vada. They built a studio in the garden, and the two young guys settled down to paint. Roland's style shows a little bit of Cubism, a little bit of architecture. In fact, he'd met Georges Braque, became one of his first friends in Paris, and Cubism was a strong influence in Roland's work. Some of his paintings suggest the nostalgia of the expatriate, and they dwell on arrivals and departures. He developed a pleasant style of great sensitivity and observation, but it was not one that was ever going to earn him the position he occupies in today's history of modern art. For that, he needed a catalyst. And one day, when he least expected it, his catalyst announced her arrival by ringing the little brass doorbell outside his house, Villa des Mimosas. To this day, that little bell is still there. But when it rang on this occasion in 1924, it announced the start of a chain of events that was to deliver Surrealism to Britain and this lady into Roland's life. Her name, Valentine Bouet. She was a Surrealist poet, already known to Paul Éluard and André Breton. They married. They began to live in Cassis. We believe that's Valentine sitting in the back of the car, and you can see she's in a really filthy temper. Valentine frequently had extreme mood swings. We'd probably understand her today as having a hormonal difficulty. But Roland found it really exciting. It was such a contrast to his well-modulated mum. Later, he found it a little hard to cope with. They moved from Cassis to Château-le-Puy, near Valentine's hometown of Condom-sur-Bèze in the Gers. And for a while, they were happy. Valentine loved the isolation of the place and the abundant wildlife. And Roland painted her like this. When I first saw this painting, my eye was immediately drawn to the cat. I said to my dad, "That's a bad-tempered looking cat, isn't it?" "Yes," he said. "It was so wild, no one except Valentine could get near it. And when she held it, it would growl and hiss the whole time." Look at the cat's ears. Look at the cat's eyes. Look at Valentine's eyes. She shows the same wild and intense quality, and indeed she was never, ever tamed. Roland and Valentine became friends with the guy with the white hair. His name, Max Ernst. The lady there, Marie-Berthe Orange, that's Max's wife. And Max and Roland got on wonderfully well, and Max was like the front runner of the Surrealist artists at the time. And he had this technique that he'd worked on called frottage, and Roland picked it up immediately. It's like brass rubbing. You take the paper, you put it on a rough surface, you rub it all over with pencil or crayon, you rediscover the surface underneath. It's perfect for making these wonderful dreamlike sequences so fond of by the Surrealists. And then Roland's painting became more Surrealist. The wonderful thing is the way Surrealist paintings provoke questions. Is it a boat? Is it a bath? Is that a cloud of steam or Roland's erotic fantasy? Well, what's it doing in this scorching temperature of this arid desert? All questions. And if as a kid I asked my father, what does it mean? He would say, it means whatever it means to you, and that is the right answer. And that's the generosity of Surrealism. There's no wrong answers for you. Well, Roland painted this picture, and I believe it's autobiographical. He called it Conversation Between Rock and Flower. The flower, I think, is Valentine, because we see the duality of the beauty of her on one side and the ugly witch on the other. And the poor old rock doesn't know what he's going to get next. Is it the witch or the beautiful flower? So he's made himself into this chunk of granite, peeping up nervously to see what the flower's going to do next, always with an olive branch as an offering. But Roland did love Valentine tenderly. We can see that from this portrait of a leaf. She makes eye contact with us, but the profile on the same side of her face signals that she can look sideways at things that we cannot see. And I take this to reference Valentine's ability as a clairvoyante. She used to use her tarot cards to predict our futures with impressive accuracy. The tension between Roland and Valentine started to build. She studied Sanskrit and the Hindu religion at the Sorbonne. She wanted to dedicate her life to the search for nirvana. Roland wanted to change the world for better through the agency of Surrealism. Their paths were diverging. Seeking a reconciliation, Roland took Valentine to India. They were there for nearly 3 months, and he reverted to painting in this lovely pictorial style, perhaps trying to tell Valentine that for the moment at least he had left Surrealism behind in Paris. Valentine loved India. She wanted to go native. But on their return, the tensions remained, and they separated. And Roland came to London to live in Hampstead. And that is where he met Henry Moore, because Henry was part of the artistic community. And I believe it was around this time, probably 1935, they met for the first time. And Roland's studio in his house at 21 Downshire Hill became an important place for Henry and other artists and curators to meet. One of the key figures was Herbert Reed, who became an important friend of both Henry and Roland's. Humphrey Jennings, Paul Nash, and others were part of this fascinating group. And it was about this time that Roland, Herbert Reed, and David Gascoigne and others created the 1936 International Surrealist Exhibition. It opened in June at the New Burlington Galleries in Piccadilly, and it had a wonderful catalogue which contained entries by all the artists from Europe and from Britain. André Breton showed up to open the show. And standing behind André Breton on the right-hand side of the picture, the work of art there is by Roland Penrose. He called it The Last Voyage of Captain Cook. The critics slammed the show, calling for the public to be protected from the ravings of these deranged people who called themselves Surrealists. And one of the most vicious of the critics was Mr. Manson. He was then the director of the Tate Gallery. And this is wonderfully ironic because at the moment the Tate Gallery owns 5 of Roland Penrose's works, including Captain Cook's Last Voyage. That is very satisfying. Well, Salvador Dali turned up dressed in a diving suit to give his lecture. He said he wanted to descend to the depths of the subconscious, and he nearly made a job of it because he nearly suffocated inside the suit. There were all kinds of people. It was Éluard, Breton, and Éluard and Breton are Mezans. They selected the European works, and Roland, Herbert Reed, and David Gascoigne sought out the British artists, and Henry Moore's work was part of their selection. As we can see from the installation shots, Henry's work was prominently displayed in the large room, confirmed by this annotation in Roland's plan for the show. I can't tell you from what material the work is made, but the second work Roland included is in the same room, looks rather like a bronze. The show was a fantastic success. It really was the moment that Surrealism arrived in Britain. And when it was all over, Paul Éluard invited Roland and Valentine, with whom he was enjoying a temporary rapprochement, to join him, his wife Nouche, his daughter Cécile, for a holiday in Mougins on the Côte d'Azur. Picasso and Man Ray were there. Picasso was deeply concerned about the horrors of the Spanish Civil War, and this prompted Roland and Valentine to go to Barcelona in support of the Republican cause. They were in Catalonia for 6 weeks. Their purpose was surveying the works of art in Republican hands, photographing it, and reporting back to Britain that, contrary to Franco's propaganda, the art treasures were safe and well cared for. On their return, Roland could not get his text or images published anywhere. The British press was strongly biased against the Republican cause. At this point, Henry Moore was involved with the Artists International Association to the point where he designed this poster. Evidently, he and Roland shared very similar ideals. In a parallel movement, Roland's friend, the artist Fred Ullman, who had escaped from Nazi Germany and was part of the Artists' Refugee Committee, they managed to get 32 artists out of Germany and settled them among their friends in Britain. And if they'd stayed in Germany, they would have undoubtedly been murdered by the Nazis. But there was opposition. Sadly and shamefully, there were objections from people who were sympathetic to refugees had to tread carefully to avoid social alienation, as there was a strongly prevalent anti-Semitic culture among many people at that time. It was not a noble chapter in Britain's history, but many, like Roland's friend John Christie of Glyndebourne, did everything they could to find work and shelter for refugees. On their return to Paris from Catalonia, Roland and Valentine had to admit they'd reached the end of their road. Valentine returned to India, and Roland painted her for the last time like this. She had gone. So, for source material, he used this photograph by Man Ray. Her face in the painting is blue, the blue of sadness, maybe the blue of infinity, maybe the blue of nirvana. Green woodpeckers and a dove perch in her hair, while butterflies cluster around her eyes and lips, an attestation of her closeness to nature. But the killer punch in this portrait is the rose with its thorns puncturing Valentine's tender skin around her neck. The rose, so often a metaphor for love. But Roland goes beyond that. The Penrose family motto is nulla rosa sine spina. No rose without thorns. And I believe Roland is saying, it's true. There is no rose without thorns. There's no love without pain. In June 1937, Roland went back to Paris to visit Max Ernst. They'd heard there was a fancy dress party going on given by the daughters of the Rochas family, the couturiers, so they dressed as beggars, and they went along. And Roland hadn't been there very long when he met this lady. She was dressed on the occasion, but not for very long. Her name was Lee Miller, and Roland described the sensation of meeting her as like being struck by lightning. He was never the same again. Lee Miller born in 1907 in Poughkeepsie, New York, knew Paris intimately because for 3 years from 1929, she'd been the lover, the model, and the assistant of this man, Man Ray, the American surrealist living in Paris, the man whose name at that time meant modern photography. Lee accidentally discovered the technique of solarization, which she and Man Ray both used. She became a surrealist photographer in her own right, finding the image trouvée, that's the counterpart to the surrealist objet trouvé, and it became her style. She titled this Exploding Hand. Actually, it's the door of the Guerlain perfume shop, the Parfumerie Guerlain, and the puff of the explosion is in fact the countless scratches made on the glass by the diamond rings of the clientele. Creatively, Lee and Man Ray were a perfect fit, leading to the production of some of their most important works. But as lovers, their relationship was deeply fraught. Man Ray was possessive of Lee. He wanted her all to himself, but she refused to give up her freedom, and he nearly went mad trying to control this uncontrollable woman. After 3 years, she left him, went to New York, and established her own studio. This was the wrong moment to do it. 1933, the back end of the Depression was still having a serious effect, but she began her studio, and because she came from Paris with that French chic, she began getting jobs that the American photographers could not get. That kind of wonderful classy elegance in the pack shots. She used solarization and she used solarization for some of her portraits. This was the British actress Lillian Harvey. She wanted really arresting portraits to send to Hollywood casting directors. 2 years on, the studio was really doing well. It was the place to go for your portrait. And this guy shows up. His name? Aziz Eloui Bey. He'd met Lee in Paris some years before. He asked Lee to marry him. And to everyone's shock, if not horror, she did. She closed the New York studio, boarded a liner for Alexandria, and moved in to the expatriate community in Cairo. To begin with, it was wonderful. She did not have to worry about running a studio and financial disasters and things like that. But very quickly, something she hadn't accounted for crept up on her: boredom. She described the people as the black satin and pearls sets, and the most exciting conversation they could have was about the cucumber sandwiches at the polo match. So very quickly, she grabbed her camera and went off making long-range excursions into the desert. If you ever saw the movie The English Patient, you remember the sequence where the car gets bogged in? They were only two-wheel drive cars. In a sandstorm, that's exactly the kind of thing she was doing. She found the monastery of Wadi Natrun, photographing the sensual breast-like domes made ironic by the celibate Coptic monks living within. And way off in the great sand desert, she found an abandoned rest house. It had European windows. They were fitted with fly screens, but this fly screen had broken. She waited until the white cloud had got in exactly the right place. It's a metaphor for her desire for freedom. She wants to burst through that netting, clear off down that road, and in the sky, the cloud, or is it a bird, or is it a cloud? You choose. That symbolizes the freedom she seeks. She called it a portrait of space because the little rectangular frame was a hatch through which you put your hand to close the storm shutters. The flap has gone, but it's left a portrait-style frame, and it shows space. And that's her gift to you to populate with your own dreams and your own imaginings. Aziz, ever indulgent, knew that Lee was still pining for her artist friends and the life of Paris, so he bought her an airline ticket from Cairo to Marseille. That was a big deal in those days. She landed in Marseille, took the train to Paris, And on the night she arrived, that's when she met Roland Penrose. Well, Roland immediately took her to Cornwall. He was renting his brother's house on the Foul River at Lamb Creek, and it became a kind of Surrealist summer camp. It was remote, it was excluded, and nobody could overlook and see what they were up to. So they had this wonderful free time. On the left of the picture we see Lee, then Nush Eluard, Paul's wife, Joseph Bard, who was Eileen Agar's partner, and then Paul Eluard. Here is Lee. Next to her, Adi Fidelin, the first serious girlfriend in Man Ray's life in the 5 years since Lee has been absent. Then there's Nush Eluard. And then there's Leonora Carrington, who had only met Max Ernst a few days earlier, so they were making up for lost time. And into that wonderful group of absolutely amazing people, there came Henry and Irina Moore. But we don't have a photograph, but we know they were there because Henry drew his feet on holiday, and that was his trip to Cornwall. Well, after Cornwall, they nearly all of them went to the south coast of France, to the Côte d'Azur, to a little place called Mougins. And it was a wonderful Surrealist gathering. On the left, there's Paul and Nush Eluard. On the right, there's Man Ray and Adi Fidelin. And in the middle, that is what an uptight Englishman looks like when he's hanging out with the woman of his dreams in the south of France. It's Roland Penrose, and I think he's looking happy. There should have been 2 other people at that party, Picasso and Dora Maar. But they'd had a ferocious row that morning, so they stayed behind to cool off. Picasso was fascinated by the beautiful women that surrounded him, but particularly by Lee. He painted her 6 times, à la Arlésienne, like a woman from Arles. The women from Arles were then known and still are known for being exceptionally beautiful. If you don't believe me, go there, see for yourself. There is something around them that is absolutely fabulous. And he painted her à la Arlésienne as a kind of a compliment. Well, Roland bought this version and gave it to my mum, and it hung in our home when I was a kid. And it was terribly embarrassing because my school chums would have heard that she had had her portrait painted by a famous artist. Could they go and see it? And I'd take them through and they'd stand in front of that and they'd say, "Ah, does your mum really look like that?" And after many years, I had to concede that she did. And you'll notice that profile matches her photograph very, very accurately. In that wonderful holiday in Mougins, Roland began making collage using picture postcards, and of course one of the first features Lee. There she is on the right as a frottage, and on the left I think that's her alter ego, her beak open, making some salty American wisecrack, and her plumage this wild array of feathers. Roland made many collages in that moment. And this one, Magnetic Moths, is collection of the Tate. It does look like a moth being inexorably drawn to this candle flame with its great, big, googly eyes. The candle's composed of images of L'Opéra Garnier in Paris, perhaps symbolizing the allure of French culture he found so irresistible. After the holiday, Lee reluctantly returned to Cairo, and her marvelously kind husband, Aziz, welcomed her back. Alone and tormented by his lack of Lee, Roland, after a brief stay in Paris, which is when he bought the Picasso portrait of Lee, returned to England. He wrote to Lee, 6th of October, 1937. Of course, I've been trying to revive all my pre-Lee activities so as to not quite go batty all at once. I called on Henry Moore in the country near Dover. I showed him your portrait. They gave me dinner. Ham, eggs, fresh mushrooms. It was very charming. I hurried on in the dark and the rain to find my house entirely occupied by you, darling. Your phantom. But I can't live with a phantom. My love, come back. I think this was the moment that led Roland to buy the large work in Hornton stone titled Mother and Child. Henry delivered it to Roland's house in Downshire Hill, Hampstead. Roland was delighted with the work and told me he felt so endeared to Henry, who, as he left, said to Roland, "If you get tired of it, tell me, and I'll change it for another one." Half a century later, Roland talked about that moment with affection and admiration for Henry's total lack of vanity. The position of mother and child in front of his house in Hampstead was to cause considerable concern among the neighbours, and Roland returned from France to find that mother and child had become a sensation in the local press, with a delegation of the locals demanding the work be removed before it offends too many other people. She stayed. She stayed in the same place all through the Blitz. And that was a remarkable piece of survival because, sadly, Barbara Hepworth's work in the back garden was obliterated when an escaped barrage balloon crashed down into the garden and smashed it to pieces. Roland's friend Edouard Mezins and his partner Sybil clearly appreciated mother and child, and it looks like Sybil is competing for the best profile competition here. I don't think she had a chance. But about this time, Roland, missing Lee, painted her like this. It's a wonderfully intuitive portrait of the deeply hidden parts of Lee's personality. Look at her legs. They're earthy, like somebody's dug down through the soil. Lee was earthy, her feet firmly planted. She was solidly grounded and practical. But her body's become the sky. It's as if she doesn't inhabit it. And I think that's a reference to her ability to dissociate, which is probably linked to an extreme trauma she suffered as a child. Although Roland understood the effect, he never knew the cause of this trauma. Lee kept that secret from him her entire life. The secret was that at the age of 7, she was raped and infected with gonorrhea. This was 1914. It was about 15 years before the antibiotics needed to cure her were discovered, so she had to endure frequent and highly invasive treatments that were given to her by her mum, who was fortunately a nurse. Children survive experiences like this by dissociating. What happens is they kind of like move out of their emotions. They become cut off from them in a way. For some people, it's a horrible sentence for the rest of their life. But Lee learned to use this. And when she later became a combat photographer in Europe, she used that ability to disconnect from her emotions really well. Her buddy, the combat photographer, the American David Sherman, told me, Lee Miller was never afraid of the evil that men can do. Roland's given her the sun for her face, just in the same way as Picasso gave her a yellow face. And I think that's an acknowledgement of the incredible intensity of her intellect and the warmth of her personality. She has sunshine yellow for both of those attributes. Her hands are birds. One hand is a dove. Remember Noah's Ark? They sent off a raven, it couldn't be bothered to come back. They sent off a dove, it returned with an olive leaf in its beak. It was loyal, that dove. It was returning to its friends. Lee was incredibly loyal to her friends. And the swallow. Swallows live in North Africa. They migrate from North Africa and they settle in the eaves of our houses. Roland was so wishing Lee would migrate from North Africa and settle in the leaves of his house. Well, earth, air, fire, no water. Water, so often the metaphor for emotion. Dissociated people don't like emotion in others. It's embarrassing for them. So Roland has carefully provided some funnels to catch that moisture, catch that water, that emotion, and take it away. Roland continued working and he continued writing to Lee and told her about what he was making. he told her about making this, became the dew machine. And Lee gave him instructions to make a work for her, which was a bracelet made of teeth around a wrist from a mannequin. Dew machine became the invisible isle. No, it's not Lee. It's not supposed to be Lee. This beautiful female presence that is existing in day and night at the same time, in good weather and bad weather, dusting her blessing over this little village. No, that's not Lee. Lee's in the foreground. Do you see the hand that looks like it's on this side of the picture plane? Yeah, that's Lee, inside the room with us. 1938, Lee and Roland met in Athens, and they traveled by road into Romania. They knew the war was coming. They wanted to photograph the peasant people of Romania. They did so with a musicologist called Harry Brauner. And they went to all these festivals and they photographed everything that was going on. They knew this way of life was so fragile. They knew the Nazis were likely to invade Romania because Romania sits on top of a lot of oil. And indeed, their fears were right, because when Lee returned to Romania in the winter of 1945-46, she found very few of these people were still there. Most of the Roma and the Sinti had been taken away and murdered by the Nazis. Back home after that trip, Roland started making the layout for a poem about their adventures, illustrated with his own photographs. The narrative has become a stream of conscious. It's a sequence of events at random. And in fact, we believe it is probably the only photo book by a British surrealist. Lovers who escape, who are free to separate, free to reunite, leave their tongues plaited together, hidden in the dry grass, folded in peasant cloth, embalmed in the green memories of desire. Under the imprint of the London Gallery, Roland published it. He called it "The Road is Wider Than Long." We don't know the name of Roland's printer at the Bradley Press, but he had a great technical ability and a touching generosity in making his big selection of different fonts available to Roland, with several changes of colour. Copy number 1 was for Lee. "Lee, who caught me in her cup of gold," the dedication reads. Beautiful, poetic, and discreet. Discreet because Lee was still married to Aziz, and Roland was heading for Egypt to give her this book, and he wanted the words to be oblique enough to avoid leading to an embarrassing confrontation. The drawing from the little sailing boat comes from an object he made in 1936, titled "Le Paradis des Alouettes," the Paradise of Larks. He went to find Lee in Egypt, bearing with him as gifts the very first copy of "The Road is Wider Than Long" and a pair of gold handcuffs. Lee said she found both presents thoroughly captivating. It was now that Aziz realized that he had come to the end of the line with Lee. He loved her dearly. He had told her some years previously that he was not going to let her go until she found somebody who loved her as much as he did and could look after her as well as he did. And when he met Roland, he realized that moment had come. With great sadness, he gave Lee her freedom. He gave her money. He gave her his blessing. He continued to love her right up until he died 1 year before she did. And he gave her a boat ride ticket to London. And after various adventures, Lee arrived in London, in Roland's house, the 3rd of September 1939, the very first day of the Second World War. Roland joined the Air Raid Protection Corps. They were the first responders. Night after night after night, they were the people who tried to help those whose houses and factories had been hit by the bombs, tried to help put out the fires. It was horrific. It was traumatic. Night after night, he and thousands of other men with very little training, very little equipment did that. And by day, he painted scary pictures like this to expiate the fears of the night. Lee took a job at Vogue magazine as a photographer. But she was bored to the point of stupefaction with taking pictures that seemed irrelevant of frocks and handbags, so she went out in the street, again finding the found image. She called this Remington Silent. That was the manufacturer's name of the typewriter. But no, it's not silent now, because that image gives you thousands of words about the destruction of war. And the joke was often in the titling: Nonconformist Chapel, Bridge of Sighs, Exceptional Achievement. I think Mrs. Goose is saying to the gander, what are we going to feed it on when it hatches? 1940, the Surrealists were not cowed by the Blitz. They had a huge exhibition at the Zwemmer Gallery. It was also a bookshop, and it was a very favourite place for all of them to gather and to show. And on this occasion, Henry Moore was there with his beautiful reclining figure made in elmwood. And if you look closely at the installation shots just behind, on the wall there is a photograph by Lee Miller, one that she took some years earlier in Egypt. And this is the first time Lee, Roland, and Henry ever showed in the same exhibition, and I think it was probably the last time as well. As part of the London Gallery, Roland made this little magazine called the London Bulletin. It was a small magazine edited by Edouard Mezens, and the first edition coincided with the opening of the gallery. Subsequent editions covered the current shows, and we see Roland and Ithell Colquhoun as the only British Surrealists here featured among the Europeans. It's quite a lineup. Much of the content was highly politicized with good reasons. The Surrealists had witnessed the effects of the non-intervention policy that led to Franco's fascist takeover of Spain, and understood that Britain had sleepwalked right into Hitler's similar trap. The war forced the closure of the gallery, and the last issue was June 1940 with colour illustrations. Roland knew how important it is for an artist to get representation and to have their work shown. The London Gallery and the London Bulletin was his way of promoting modern art and Surrealism. But it must be noticed that the featured artists were not all Surrealists, although that was the dominant movement of the group. Henry Moore was one of the few Surrealist sculptors, and the only one in the London Gallery stable, although some of the group quarrelled with him later when he carved a Madonna, considered to be a religious work, and therefore a dreadful breach of the rules. The Surrealists considered religion to be one of the enemies of society, recognizing it as a form of state control over the population. For me, and this is just my personal view, it suggests to me that Henry had the strength and the individuality to carve whatever he liked, and the symbol of a mother of a child and her child belongs to the world in general, and placing that work in a church does not limit its meaning to a Christian interpretation. Roland joined the Home Guard and became a lecturer in camouflage, first for the Home Guard, then for the Army, and he published this definitive work on camouflage early on, which he illustrated with his own drawings. His understanding of the way animals have patterning that conceals them provided him with a lot of useful material, but his greatest triumph was when, with the help of David Sherman, he photographed Lee like this, covered in the latest Elizabeth Arden cosmetic camouflage cream. He used it as a lantern slide in his lectures, and a little later he wrote to Lee, "Lee, darling, my slides of you have made my lectures the best attended in the camp. Some chaps come back 2 or 3 times." Well, there was no time for Roland and Lee to settle into domestic bliss. The Blitz began. The bombs started to rain on London. And at the beginning of the war, Henry had also enrolled in the Home Guard. And in 1941, that move was a significant recognition in 1941, in a move that was a significant recognition of him and his work, he was made a war artist. At the end of the war, he wrote, "Happiest thing for all is that I've been able to go on working all through, although not all the time at exactly what I would have liked. That is, I've not been free to give the majority and the proper proportion of my time to my real work of sculpture, but that's no longer so. Henry's eloquent understanding of the reclining form served him well in these drawings. Where the people assume such a solid mass, they appear to be carved in stone. I wonder if that was a metaphor for the tough stoicism of the Londoners. I'm sure if Goering had seen Henry's drawings, he would have immediately realized there was no chance of his Luftwaffe bombing us into submission. They are so tough. They're so enduring. In 1943, the role of Henry and other war artists was recognized by the amazing producer and director of documentary films, Jill Craigie, who made the film Out of Chaos, about the importance of art to society in wartime. Jill Craig's sequence on Henry is masterfully revealing of Henry's respect of the people he is drawing, as well as his perception and his techniques. He makes this work while being filmed on camera, and we see this astonishingly beautiful technique of first making the drawing in white crayon and then washing it over in dark grey watercolor. And the white crayon resists the wash and the figures magically emerge on the page. Lee was there to document the shoot. By now there were few bombing raids over London, but the V-1s and V-2 pilotless bombs made appearances frequently enough to make using the shelters a necessity. The form was the trains stopped running at about 9 p.m, and then the stations filled up with people sheltering from the bombs. On this occasion, the film unit took over Holborn Station. It seems Henry showed a similar interest in the track maintenance workers as he did in the film shoot, but Jill Craigie positioned him carefully, and they lit the whole scene with great ingenuity. So it looked realistic, and we get a clear understanding of the crowding and the discomfort these people endured. Lee uses the film lighting to good effect and captures Henry's calm concentration. A few days later, the whole unit reunited in Henry's studio right here. The customarily filling up the place with massive power-hungry lights that threatened to demolish the entire electricity supply, but that doesn't seem to faze Henry. When we look at these shots, we see his self-confidence and calmness, a solid, unruffled Yorkshireman who was capable of huge sensitivity and creative passion. And we remember the tender beauty of his drawing that he was making on camera for the film. When we see he was surrounded by a mob of people, masses of equipment, and the demands of the film director, we have to marvel at the power of his composure. Irina was there. She doesn't feature in the film, but Lee acknowledges how close she was to Henry. In her shots from 1941, Lee shows their friendly intimacy. And here we see a woman who seems as though she's a little shy, and she'd rather have a uniquely personal role than be a prominent part of Henry's conspicuous success. And Lee notes her fondness for board games, and it was really super to see that board still in their house there today. In 1942, Lee, as an American, became a fully accredited war correspondent with the US Army for Vogue magazine. Her first assignment after D-Day was covering the field hospital in Normandy. Her stories dominated Vogue features for the next year and a half. The US Army Field Hospital was at Breck Field, just behind Omaha Beach, and it was coping with a constant flow of casualties as the troops pushed inland. On Lee's next assignment, she crossed the boundary forbidden to women. She stumbled on a full-scale battle in the port of San Malo and instantly became a combat photographer covering the siege of San Malo. All this made Roland feel a little inadequate. He was in a safe rear echelon position while she was risking her life under fire. But what really got to him was when Lee arrived in Paris during the liberation and found Picasso in his studio in Rue des Grands Augustins. Roland smuggled himself on an army plane to Paris to join Lee in her reunion. That's Roland, back left. Then Louis Aragon and Lee with Aragon's wife, Elsa Triolet, seated in front. And in the front row there's Picasso on the left, Nuche and Paul Éluard. It's a reunion. Why the long faces? The long faces are there because censorship is being lifted, and the fate of the thousands, the tens of thousands of Parisians, I think it was over 100,000, who were taken away by the Nazis, is beginning to be understood. They were taken off in trucks, in railway trains. They were never seen again. Nobody really understood what had happened to them, but now it was beginning to be understood that they had all been murdered by the Nazis and they were never, ever coming home. And all of these people lost a great many friends like that. Picasso had to keep on working all through the winter of 44-45 just to keep his morale up, to keep himself sane. In that time, food was very short, so his favorite model became the tomato plant vine on the windowsill of his studio, and he painted her tenderly lots of times. But not even Picasso or Éluard or anybody else could keep Lee in Paris in the winter of 44-45, because the toughest fighting of the whole war was taking place in Alsace. She was on the heels of the Allies when they crossed into Germany. She was there when they started liberating the concentration camps, arriving at Dachau on the day of this liberation. The war was already very personal to Lee Miller because so many of her friends were Jewish and large numbers of them were missing. She cabled her editor, "I implore you to believe this is true." American Vogue published many of her images. The effect of this on Lee, though, the effect of witnessing the Holocaust up close and personal, was catastrophic. When she finally returned to England, she was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Nobody had a name for it. Nobody understood it. You just put up, shut up. It was a stiff upper lip. You carried on. Everybody else was carrying on. And if you couldn't deal with the horrible traumas that were still churning around inside you, you drank whiskey. And then more whiskey. And Lee entered a downward spiral of depression and alcohol abuse, and Roland, who felt powerless to help her, made her invisible wounds visible in this painting of her damaged internally, fragmented, tormented, washed up on a beach under the clouds of a gathering storm. His painting, Unsleeping Beauty, it documents Lee's descent into her own private hell of PTSD. Lee was told she could never, ever become pregnant. I proved her wrong. In the spring of 1947, that's when I began. And I'm evidence that she carried me full term, but it was a difficult time for her. Roland was fascinated by her pregnancy, and shortly before I was born, painted us like this. Way before ultrasound, he got me perfectly. Once you've seen that picture, you'll recognize me anywhere if you see me. I was so much better looking, of course, but then there you go. Well, when you look at Lee's face, there was maternal feelings there, but anxiety. It didn't last. Lee did not, in real life, have the usual maternal feelings. And Roland, understanding that she was still in a pretty bad shape, bought Farley Farmhouse. It's about 50 miles south of London, many similarities to being here in Perry Green. And very quickly, Lee, although the house was a wreck, started turning it into a lovely place to live. They personalized the house by painting this mural in the dining room fireplace. The moon and the planets flank a huge sun like a figure rising above the hills of the South Down, which can be clearly seen from the house. The vertical scales of the hill is exaggerated to make sure we can identify them as Windover Hill, featuring the vast prehistoric drawing of the Long Man of Wilmington. The Long Man is a solstice marker. He's clearly visible from Farley's. He's on a north-facing slope, so he only catches the sunlight in the summer months. He's a sun god, and Roland brought him to our hearth to be our household god. And he brings us abundance. He brings us good things to eat. And that's why we have the cornucopia figures in the ingle nooks beside the fireplace. 1948, Henry's work was featured in the Venice Biennale. And here, Roland and Henry are sipping Americanos at Florian's Bar in St. Mark's Square, Venice. Henry later stated, for the 1948 Venice Biennale, the first one after the war, the British Council decided to have just my sculpture and Turner paintings, which was a very sensible thing. Yeah, I agree, Henry, it was a very sensible thing to do. And the chosen sculpture was Mother and Child, lent by Roland. Roland was so proud that the British Council had shipped that work there and to many other locations in many other countries. And I think he saw it as a wonderful validation of the sculpture that had earned the scorn of his Hampstead neighbours just over 10 years earlier. With Roland and Henry in St. Mark's Square were Peter Gregory, the chairman of Lund Humphreys, the publishers, and benefactor of modern art and artists. And the woman on the right is Dorothy Morland, who's just become the director of the ICA. Lee covered the event for Vogue magazine, and this shot made it into British Vogue's August 1948 edition, with Henry pole position, top left-hand page. It's a fabulous double-page spread. It features prominent artists from all the other countries, including that shot of Henry talking to Gino Severini. In her text, Lee describes Henry's delight with the Biennale. Many years later, in 1976, Henry told BBC's Barry Penrose that the British Council did more for me as an artist than any dealer. Very soon after we moved there, Farley's became a perpetual arts conference. Max Ernst and Dorothea Tanning were among our first visitors. Picasso came to Farley's in November 1950. He and I, for that is me sitting on his knee, we made instant friends. He was kind and gentle and funny in a way that made him irresistible to children, birds, and animals. Here he is talking to our Ayrshire dairy bull, who was called William and was normally really cranky and bad-tempered. But Picasso made friends with him. Juan Miro visited in 1964 on the occasion of the exhibition of his work that Roland organized at the Tate. Roland had founded the ICA in 1947 with Herbert Reed, and their first show in February 1948 was called 40 Years of Modern Art, and included the loan of Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon from the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And the ICA brilliantly followed this show with 40,000 years of modern art. On founding the ICA, Roland had immediately been attacked from all sides by people who thought he was doing modernism all wrong, and by the defenders of the establishment who felt threatened. And Roland was a noble champion of his cause, and he just forged ahead, undeterred. Picasso had written his play Desire Caught by the Tail in January 1941, during the most despairing days of the German occupation of Paris. It was performed secretly in his studio as an act of resistance. And then Picasso arrived in Paris during the liberation. Then Roland arrived in Paris during the liberation, and Picasso gave him a copy, which Roland translated into English, and under the auspices of the ICA, he mounted a performance reading at the Steiner Hall in London in the summer of 1950, with Dylan Thomas in the key role. Dylan had known Roland since 1936 International Surrealism exhibition, and early in 1950, Dylan wrote to Caitlin, his wife, "Here is £10. Will you please, my love, collect my suit from the cleaners and send it. Then I can be in the Picasso play." Dylan played the role of Onion, friend and rival to the other character named Bigfoot. The picture post caption tells us Dylan Thomas acts as a stage manager who gives us the clues. He had the task of transforming and informing the audience of such imagined stage props as an immense bathtub filled with soapsuds. After a piece for the violin from La Tosca, from the bottom of the bathtub rise the heads of Bigfoot, the Onion, the Tart, her cousin, Round Piece, two bow wells, silence, fat anxiety, thin anxiety, and the curtains. And the scene closes with the bathers coming out of the tub. The tart is naked except for her stockings. A group of undertakers arrive with coffins. They put everyone in the coffins and nail them down and cart them away. Henry was in the audience. We don't know what he thought. I would have loved to have heard his crit of that play. And Lee was there also. So it goes to show, actually they were close friends and they were often at each other's events. Well, as we know, not long after this, in 1953, Dylan died. But for me, his role typifies the way in the diversity of Roland and Lee's circle of friends. There were so many of them, so many different persuasions, so many different talents. When Mother and Child returned from her world tour, she was one of the first sculptures to be installed at Farley's in 1953. Henry came to make sure she was aligned just right. Roland had positioned her on the ley line that runs northwards from the Long Man. I showed you that earlier. And it's an auspicious location. No wonder it looks like Henry is kneeling reverently. Mary, Henry and Irina's daughter, was there. And Lee's photograph gives us a lovely reminder of the closeness between father and daughter. And there was a group shot of us carefully arranged. I'm about a year younger than Mary. She and her parents were fun to be with. Henry was much better at hugs and cuddles than my own parents. And I liked Mary's teddy. Although she was very nice to me, she wouldn't let me play with the teddy. Mother and Child was a key figure in my life as a child. Always there. Always mysterious, always holding warmth in her solidness. And she looks like she enjoyed pretending to be taken for a ride in the wheelbarrow pushed by Sonia Orwell, the widow of George Orwell. 15 years later, the Moore family visited us again, the event coinciding with that of my Uncle Lionel and his family. Mother and Child stood on the lawn at Farley's until about 1993. By that time, I had become worried about the conservation of the work. The soft Hornton stone, a type of limestone with beautiful dark colour, seemed to be under attack from acid rain and a great many lichens. So reluctantly, I sold her, and she is now in the collection of Leeds City Art Gallery. They made a beautiful job conserving her, and now she's seen and enjoyed by thousands of admirers. Lee stopped photographing for Vogue in 1953, but she still took many pictures of her friends, like Picasso with his friend Sabartez clowning around in Villa La Canifoli in Cannes. The visits were research trips for Roland, who was currently writing his masterwork, Picasso, His Life and Work. It was the first English language biography of Picasso, and it was published in 1958. It's still in print today. But then the first foreign edition was an American version with Lee's photo on the second edition in the US. Picasso didn't read English, but people he trusted told him the book was good. So he designed the cover for the French edition. But Roland was still apprehensive about what kind of reception he would get after Picasso had read the text. He turned up at Picasso's house, and after a great deal of delaying tactics, Picasso said, "I've read your book." You can imagine how Roland's heart stood still. "I've read your book. It's good. In fact, it is so good it is as though we sat at the same table and wrote it together." And he made this wonderful dedication in crayon on the title page. In about 1956, my parents came here, accompanied by my American grandfather, that's him on the left, Theodore Miller. Theodore was an engineer of some distinction, but he immediately warmed to both Henry and his work. Roland is there in his capacity as the British Council representative in Paris and was assisting with the making and the purchase and the installation of Henry's sculpture destined to stand outside the UNESCO building in Paris. It was installed in 1958, and I feel it must have been a very proud moment for both Roland and Henry. They'd both championed modern art in the post-war years, and against huge resistance had now seen this magnificent work by Henry in such a prominent place in Paris. Lee's career was in the doldrums, but Roland moved ahead. In 1960, he was chosen by the Arts Council to curate the Picasso show at the Tate. Paradoxically, the Surrealist rebel had now become a figure of the establishment and was responsible for putting the art of revolution into museums like the Tate, previously regarded as enemy territory. The best way to make change is to be part of it, Roland said. His convictions would never allow him to stand on sidelines. Picasso didn't come for the exhibition, but he signed Roland's catalogue like this. People called the Picasso show the show of that century and the first blockbuster. There were queues around the block at Millbank. The Queen and Prince Philip visited, but others, like George Melly, viciously attacked Roland for selling out to the establishment. "What do you want?" fulminated Melly. "An invitation to the royal enclosure at Ascot? Or a knighthood?" Roland was never happier than when he had a big Picasso project on the go, although his negotiations for the purchase of the 3 dancers by the Tate for a price that amounted to about half his value took 5 years. Today, it's a key work in the Tate collection, an attestation of that friendship of Picasso and Roland. By 1968, the ICA had outgrown its location in Dover Street, and it was on the move to its present premises at Carlton House Terrace. To achieve this, Roland had to raise about $4 million in today's money, and Sotheby's held 2 big auctions of work donated by artists. The Queen came to the private view. She's looking at a sculpture donated by Henry Moore, and a work by Bridget Riley hangs behind her. Roland received his knighthood soon after. By the late 1960s, Lee had fought her way up out of her alcoholism and her depression and became known as a gourmet cook with a marvelous repertoire of weird surrealist inventions. She loved the excitement of researching new dishes, tracking down new ingredients. Mundane things like washing up were left to Patsy Murray, our devoted housekeeper, who I can assure you didn't have many moments of reading the newspaper. In 1973, I married my late wife, Susanna, and we returned home from 3 years overseas. I'd fought with Lee most of my life. Growing up with an alcoholic parent, you may understand, is difficult. But now, with her drinking under control and Susanna to help us, Lee and I established a new and happy relationship. And it was only just in time, because 18 months later, Lee died of cancer in 1977. She lived just long enough to meet our eldest daughter, Amy. Do you remember Valentine? She was a frequent visitor to Farley's. After the divorce, she and Lee and Roland became the closest of friends, and she lived with us for long periods and was very close to Lee. She died at Farley Farm in 1978. In the space of a year, Roland had lost the 2 women he loved most. He was utterly devastated, like a badly damaged ship limping through a storm adrift in an endless sea of pain. It was mainly Susanna who coped with his rescue. She made sure there was always something going on to keep his spirits up. It was not easy. He was 78 now. Failings of old age were becoming evident. As Eliza, our youngest daughter, grew up, she and Amy became frequent visitors to Roland's studios, and they used to make collages together, and Amy helped with the bigger works. And both girls loved coming to Grandad's house, where Patsy would prepare a lovely lunch on Sunday. After Picasso's book, Roland's next major work was his Tate exhibition of Miro in 1964, followed by his biography, still in print. Then in 1975, for the big Man Ray show at the ICA, he wrote the biography of Man Ray. And then in 1978, his biography of Antony Penrose came out. And in 1981, he was commissioned to write his own autobiography. They wanted an expose of the inner workings of the Surrealist movement, but it wasn't like that. Roland talks about his friends with affections and give his enemies no space at all. And on the inside covers, he listed the key people of his life, including Moore, flanked by Miro, Magritte, Mata, Man Ray, and George Melly. It's a warm and informative book. Sorry, what's that? I've got to wrap up. Okay. Warm and informative books. And yes, I wrote my own memoir about Roland, and that is published by Farley's House and Gallery. Roland actually did have another woman come into his life, and that's the lady in blue on the left, and she encouraged him to continue making collages, and they went all over the world with Roland returning with collages. He had 2 exhibitions of new work, one in London, one in Cork Street, and one in Gallery Henriette Gomis in Paris. In 1984, he was just about to have the first exhibition, combined show of him and Lee's work in Brighton, when he died of a massive stroke. His last work had been this one, which he titled The Last One, and you can see the bird flying away from the things that he loved, going towards the object on the left, Lee's lips, his motif for her. And that night I know what happened, because they all met up again. They're having a wonderful time somewhere, they're making some fabulous art. And on the morning that Roland died, the first person to phone me was Henry Moore. His strong, kind voice with that trace of a Yorkshire accent warmed me. Did I know Roland was one of the best friends he'd ever had? Did I know the first big sculpture he ever sold was to Roland, and that gave him the money and the confidence when he needed it most? He helped me, and he helped a lot of other people. He was one of the most important figures in the development of modern art in this country, said Henry. He was a good man. Today, Lee and Roland's old house at Farley Farm is an Artist House Museum, very much here, as you are here. And my daughter, Amy, is my co-curator, co-director. She helps to show people around. We have a small charity, which we set up separately, and that runs an arts awards for 14 local schools. 2017, David Dimbleby gave the prize. 2019, Peter Blake did us the same honour. The garden Roland so lovingly planted still flourishes, home to many sculptures, including the fountain he desired. And the old farm barn is now a gallery with exciting new exhibition programs, and the redundant farm building has become a gallery mainly for Lee's shows. Lee's currently at Tate Britain, and that's a wonderful circularity, with the largest ever retrospective exhibition of her work, and she's getting very good reviews. It's taken 48 years from the time we discovered her work to achieving this level of acknowledgement. And if you go there and you fight your way through the crowds, you'll find Lee's photo of Henry on the wall. My book, the biography Lives of Lee Miller, was given a special cover by Thames and Hudson to celebrate the fact that it was made into a movie called Lee, which stars Kate Winslet, who looks incredibly like Lee and acts like her as well. The voice tone, the hand gestures, her appearance as a war correspondent, thoroughly convincing. If you get to see it, you'll see a film that has authenticity and integrity, because it's a movie about a woman made by women. We'll always be glad to welcome you at Farley's, but if you want to come, we're not open every day, so please visit the website and book on there. And I hope you enjoyed meeting my parents and seeing the relationship they had with Henry Moore, because Henry to them was a very important person, and he also was to me in my own life. Thank you for being here today.
First of all, can I just say thank you very much. It was the most unbelievable talk. You always manage to so raise people's spirits through your promotion of your work. I'd just like to, one question that's always not bothered me or troubled with, I've never kind of been able to sort of think about how do I phrase the answer. When you found the works in the loft at Farley's Farm, and you realised exactly or so much of what must have contributed towards Lee's depression and difficult times, the relationship you had with her, did Roland himself ever mention that? Did he inform you to give you some of the context?
Roland was no psychologist, but he was incredibly intuitive. And he didn't really have the language to describe how he felt about Lee's condition. But what he did instead was did his very best to look after her in a very stoic and a very loyal kind of way. When I started writing Lives of Lee Miller, I was able to do a research trip around America, and luckily at that moment a great many people who had known her were still alive, and they gave me a lot of information. And I came back and I downloaded this to my father, and he was astonished because he had known nothing of what had happened. For example, she'd never told him that she'd been raped as a child. Not even her closest friends knew that. She lived her life in a sort of series of watertight compartments. And Roland knew actually very little about her achievements and about what she'd done, particularly during the war. And I kept on talking and telling him with great excitement about all the things I'd found out. And I noticed he was getting a bit withdrawn, and then I noticed he was getting a bit emotional. And that was very unusual for him. And after a while, he said, I wish we'd known. If only we'd known, we could have understood her better and done more for her. And that was a regret that I shared as well, because there's that old saying, if you know why, you can put up with a lot of what. And I wish we'd known why about Lee. Thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations on just promoting the work so wonderfully. And I know they both would be hugely proud of you.
Thank you very much.
I don't really have a question. I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. There is such an amazing hope in your story. The people who had difficulty, who had joy, and who survived through this horrible war. And the world is going to such a dark place right now, and that gives me hope that we will make it on the other end. I saw the film. It absolutely, blew my mind and heart, and I researched quite a bit about Lee, what I could online, and I'm definitely going to that house now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And it is really interesting that, just the same as you people here at Henry Moore Foundation, we are archivists, we are guardians of the past, but sometimes that past informs the present, and right now it does that more than ever before. If you want to look at the history books, we're about 1934 now with the rise of the Nazis. Shutting up the press, limiting protest, putting people in jail for things they didn't do, that kind of stuff. Yeah, let's look at the history. There's that Santayana quote, those who ignore the past are condemned to repeat it, and that should never be forgotten by anybody. So yeah, thank you. And that all of Lee and Roland's work and Henry's work is more relevant now than ever before. Thank you. And I like the bit about the hope too.
Thank you. This is probably a silly question, but is it true that you bit Picasso?
It is very true that I bit Picasso. You saw the shot of him and our dairy bull, William. Well, that night, back at our house, we started a game, and it was called bullfights. It was way before I understood how really obnoxious bullfighting is. And I was the bull, so I'd put my horns on, and at the given signal, I go thundering across the room, trying to gore Picasso, knock him over. He'd be standing there with his jacket, like in Willetta. And every time I got really close, and he'd flick the jacket out of the way, jump sideways, and I go into the wall. And after a while, I thought, something wrong with this strategy. So I stopped. And I waited, and I watched. And when he wasn't looking, I crept up, and I bit him. And he turned around and bit me straight back. And to this very day, I have never bitten another artist. That's the value of aversion therapy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antony. It's really, we're so thrilled to have you with us today, and really, what an incredible story that you tell. I mean, we're really, really, really proud to have you here today. Thank you so much. And I would just like to thank you all very much for staying with us this evening and coming out on this wet evening. I'd like to really thank also all of the team here at the Studios and Gardens. It's really been a very, very large collaborative endeavour to pull this evening off. So thank you all so much. And yeah, we hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Antony.
Thank you.